Book I, Section 1 of Tusculan Disputations by Cicero, translated by Charles Duke Young. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jeffrey Edwards. Book I, On the Contempt of Death. 1. At a time when I had entirely, or to a great degree, released myself from my labors as an advocate, and from my duties as a senator, I had recourse again, Brutus, principally by your advice, to those studies which never had been out of my mind, although neglected at times, and which, after a long interval, I resumed. And now, since the principles and rules of all arts which relate to living well depend on the study of wisdom, which is called philosophy, I have thought it an employment worthy of me to illustrate them in the Latin tongue, not because philosophy could not be understood in the Greek language, or by the teaching of Greek masters, but it has always been my opinion that our countrymen have, in some instances, made wiser discoveries than the Greeks, with reference to those subjects which they have considered worthy of devoting their attention to, and in others have improved upon their discoveries, so that in one way or other we surpass them on every point. For with regard to the manners and habits of private life, and family and domestic affairs, we certainly manage them with more elegance and better than they did. And as to our republic, that our ancestors have, beyond all dispute, formed on better customs and laws. What shall I say of our military affairs, in which our ancestors have been most eminent in valor, and still more so in discipline? As to those things which are attained not by study, but nature, neither Greece nor any nation is comparable to us. For what people has displayed such gravity, such steadiness, such greatness of soul, probity, faith, such distinguished virtue of every kind, as to be equal to our ancestors? In learning, indeed, and all kinds of literature, Greece did excel us, and it was easy to do so where there was no competition. For while among the Greeks the poets were the most ancient species of learned men, since Homer and Hesiod lived before the foundation of Rome, and Archilochus was a contemporary of Romulus, we received poetry much later. For it was about 510 years after the building of Rome before Livius published a play in the consulship of Caius Claudius, the son of Caecus, and Marcus Tuditanus, a year before the birth of Ennius, who was older than Plautus and Naevius. 2. It was, therefore, late before poets were either known or received among us, though we find in Cato De Originibus that the guests used, at their entertainments, to sing the praises of famous men to the sound of the flute. But a speech of Cato's shows this kind of poetry to have been in no great esteem, as he censures Marcus Nobilior for carrying poets with him into his province. For that consul, as we know, carried Ennius with him into Aetolia. Therefore, the less esteem poets were in, the less were those studies pursued, though even then those who did display the greatest abilities that way were not very inferior to the Greeks. Do we imagine that if it had been considered commendable in Fabius, a man of the highest rank, to paint, we should not have had many Polycleti and Parrhasii? Honor nourishes art, and glory is the spur withal to studies, while those studies are always neglected in every nation which are looked upon disparagingly. The Greeks held skill in vocal and instrumental music as a very important accomplishment, and therefore it is recorded of Epaminondas, who in my opinion was the greatest man among the Greeks, that he played excellently on the flute; and Themistocles, some years before, was deemed ignorant, because at an entertainment he declined the lyre when it was offered to him. For this reason musicians flourished in Greece. Music was a general study, and whoever was unacquainted with it was not considered as fully instructed in learning. Geometry was in high esteem with them, therefore none were more honorable than mathematicians. But we have confined this art to bare measuring and calculating. 3. But, on the contrary, we early entertained an esteem for the orator, though he was not at first a man of learning, but only quick at speaking. In subsequent times he became learned; for it is reported that Galba, Africanus, and Laelius were men of learning, and that even Cato, who preceded them in point of time, was a studious man. Then succeeded the Lepidi, Carbo, and Gracchi, and so many great orators after them down to our own times, that we were very little, if at all, inferior to the Greeks. Philosophy has been at a low ebb even to this present time, and has had no assistance from our own language. And so now I have undertaken to raise and illustrate it, in order that, as I have been of service to my countrymen when employed on public affairs, I may, if possible, be so likewise in my retirement. And in this I must take the more pains, because there are already many books in the Latin language which are said to be written inaccurately, having been composed by excellent men, only not of sufficient learning; for indeed it is possible that a man may think well, and yet not be able to express his thoughts elegantly. But for any one to publish thoughts which he can neither arrange skilfully, nor illustrate so as to entertain his reader, is an unpardonable abuse of letters and retirement. They, therefore, read their books to one another, and no one ever takes them up but those who wish to have the same license for careless writing allowed to themselves. Wherefore, if oratory has acquired any reputation from my industry, I shall take the more pains to open the fountains of philosophy from which all my eloquence has taken its rise. 4. But as Aristotle, a man of the greatest genius and of the most various knowledge, being excited by the glory of the rhetorician Isocrates, commenced teaching young men to speak, and joined philosophy with eloquence, so it is my design not to lay aside my former study of oratory, and yet to employ myself at the same time in this greater and more fruitful art. For I have always thought that to be able to speak copiously and elegantly on the most important questions was the most perfect philosophy; and I have so diligently applied myself to this pursuit, that I have already ventured to have a school like the Greeks. And lately, when you left us, having many of my friends about me, I attempted at my Tusculan villa what I could do in that way. For as I formerly used to practise declaiming, which nobody continued longer than myself, so this is now to be the declamation of my old age. I desired any one to propose a question which he wished to have discussed, and then I argued that point, either sitting or walking; and so I have compiled the scholae, as the Greeks call them, of 5 days, in as many books. We proceeded in this manner. When he who had proposed the subject for discussion had said what he thought proper, I spoke against him; for this is, you know, the old and Socratic method of arguing against another's opinion. For Socrates thought that thus the truth would more easily be arrived at. But to give you a better notion of our disputations, I will not barely send you an account of them, but represent them to you as they were carried on. Therefore let the introduction be thus. 5. A. To me death seems to be an evil. M. What, to those who are already dead, or to those who must die? A. To both. M. It is a misery, then, because an evil? A. Certainly. M. Then those who have already died, and those who have still got to die, are both miserable? A. So it appears to me. M. Then all are miserable? A. Every one. M. And indeed, if you wish to be consistent, all that are already born, or ever shall be, are not only miserable, but always will be so. For should you maintain those only to be miserable, you would not accept any one living, for all must die. But there should be an end of misery in death. But seeing that the dead are miserable, we are born to eternal misery, for they must of consequence be miserable who died 100,000 years ago, or rather all that have ever been born. A. So indeed I think. M. Tell me, I beseech you, are you afraid of the three-headed Cerberus in the shades below, and the roaring waves of Cocytus, and the passage over Acheron, and Tantalus expiring with thirst, while the water touches his chin, and Sisyphus, who sweats with arduous toil in vain, the steepy summit of the mount to gain? Perhaps, too, you dread the inexorable judges Minos and Rhadamanthus, before whom neither Lucius Crassus nor Marcus Antonius can defend you, and where, since the cause lies before Grecian judges, you will not even be able to employ Demosthenes, but you must plead for yourself before a very great assembly. These things perhaps you dread, and therefore look on death as an eternal evil. 6. A. Do you take me to be so imbecile as to give credit to such things? M. What, do you not believe them? A. Not in the least. M. I am sorry to hear that. A. Why, I beg? M. Because I could have been very eloquent in speaking against them. A. And who could not on such a subject? Or what trouble is it to refute these monstrous inventions of the poets and painters? M. And yet you have books of philosophers full of arguments against these. A. A great waste of time, truly, for who is so weak as to be concerned about them? M. If, then, there is no one miserable in the infernal regions, there can be no one there at all. A. I am altogether of that opinion. M. Where, then, are those you call miserable, or what place do they inhabit? For if they exist at all, they must be somewhere. A. I, indeed, am of opinion that they are nowhere. M. Then they have no existence at all? A. Even so, and yet they are miserable for this very reason, that they have no existence. M. I had rather, now, have you afraid of Cerberus than speak thus inaccurately. A. In what respect? M. Because you admit him to exist whose existence you deny with the same breath. Where now is your sagacity? When you say any one is miserable, you say that he who does not exist does exist. A. I am not so absurd as to say that. M. What is it that you do say, then? A. I say, for instance, that Marcus Crassus is miserable in being deprived of such great riches as his by death; that Cnaeus Pompey is miserable in being taken from such glory and honor; and, in short, that all are miserable who are deprived of this light of life. M. You have returned to the same point, for to be miserable implies an existence, but you just now denied that the dead had any existence. If, then, they have not, they can be nothing, and if so, they are not even miserable. A. Perhaps I do not express what I mean, for I look upon this very circumstance, not to exist after having existed, to be very miserable. M. What, more so than not to have existed at all? Therefore, those who are not yet born are miserable because they are not? And we ourselves, if we are to be miserable after death, were miserable before we were born? But I do not remember that I was miserable before I was born, and I should be glad to know, if your memory is better, what you recollect of yourself before you were born. 7. A. You are pleasant, as if I had said that those men are miserable who are not born, and not that they are so who are dead. M. You say, then, that they are so? A. Yes, I say that because they no longer exist, after having existed they are miserable. M. You do not perceive that you are asserting contradictions. For what is a greater contradiction than that that should be not only miserable, but should have any existence at all, which does not exist? When you go out at the Capene gate, and see the tombs of the Calatini, the Scipios, Servili, and Metelli, do you look on them as miserable? A. Because you press me with a word, henceforward I will not say they are miserable absolutely, but miserable on this account, because they have no existence. M. You do not say then, Marcus Crassus is miserable, but only miserable Marcus Crassus. A. Exactly so. M. As if it did not follow that whatever you speak of in that manner either is or is not. Are you not acquainted with the first principles of logic? For this is the first thing they lay down. Whatever is asserted, for that is the best way that occurs to me at the moment of rendering the Greek term axioma, if I can think of a more accurate expression hereafter, I will use it, is asserted as being either true or false. When, therefore, you say, miserable Marcus Crassus, you either say this, Marcus Crassus is miserable, so that some judgment may be made whether it is true or false, or you say nothing at all. A. Well, then, I now own that the dead are not miserable, since you have drawn from me a concession that they who do not exist at all cannot be miserable. What then? We that are alive, are we not wretched, seeing we must die? For what is there agreeable in life, when we must night and day reflect that at some time or other we must die? 8. M. Do you not then perceive how great is the evil from which you have delivered human nature? A. By what means? M. Because, if to die were miserable to the dead, to live would be a kind of infinite and eternal misery. Now, however, I see a goal, and when I have reached it, there is nothing more to be feared. But you seem to me to follow the opinion of Epicharmus, a man of some discernment, and sharp enough for a Sicilian. A. What opinion? For I do not recollect it. M. I will tell you if I can in Latin, for you know I am no more used to bring in Latin sentences in a Greek discourse than Greek in a Latin one. A. And that is right enough. But what is that opinion of Epicharmus? M. I would not die, but yet am not concerned that I shall be dead. A. I now recollect the Greek. But since you have obliged me to grant that the dead are not miserable, proceed to convince me that it is not miserable to be under a necessity of dying. M. That is easy enough, but I have greater things in hand. A. How comes that to be so easy, and what are those things of more consequence? M. Thus. Because if there is no evil after death, then even death itself can be none. For that which immediately succeeds that is a state where you grant that there is no evil, so that even to be obliged to die can be no evil, for that is only the being obliged to arrive at a place where we allow that no evil is. A. I beg you will be more explicit on this point, for these subtle arguments force me sooner to admissions than to conviction. But what are those more important things about which you say that you are occupied? M. To teach you, if I can, that death is not only no evil, but a good. A. I do not insist on that, but should be glad to hear you argue it, for even though you should not prove your point, yet you will prove that death is no evil. But I will not interrupt you. I would rather hear a continued discourse. M. What if I should ask you a question? Would you not answer? A. That would look like pride. But I would rather you should not ask, but where necessity requires. 9. M. I will comply with your wishes, and explain as well as I can what you require, but not with any idea that, like the Pythian Apollo, what I say must needs be certain and indisputable. but as a mere man endeavoring to arrive at probabilities by conjecture; for I have no ground to proceed further on than probability. Those men may call their statements indisputable who assert that what they say can be perceived by the senses, and who proclaim themselves philosophers by profession. A. Do as you please. We are ready to hear you. M. The first thing, then, is to inquire what death, which seems to be so well understood, really is. For some imagine death to be the departure of the soul from the body; others think that there is no such departure, but that soul and body perish together, and that the soul is extinguished with the body. Of those who think that the soul does depart from the body, some believe in its immediate dissolution, others fancy that it continues to exist for a time, and others believe that it lasts forever. There is great dispute even what the soul is, where it is, and whence it is derived. With some, the heart itself (cor) seems to be the soul. Hence the expressions excordes, vecordes, concordes; and that prudent Nasica, who was twice consul, was called corculus, id est, wise heart; and Aelius Sextus is described as egregie cordatus homo catus Aeliu Sextus. That great wise-hearted man, sage Aelius. Empedocles imagines the blood which is suffused over the heart to be the soul. To others, a certain part of the brain seems to be the throne of the soul; others neither allow the heart itself, nor any portion of the brain, to be the soul, but think either that the heart is the seat and abode of the soul, or else that the brain is so. Some would have the soul or spirit to be the anima, as our schools generally agree; and indeed the name signifies as much, for we use the expressions animam agere, to live; animam efflare, to expire; animosi, men of spirit; bene animati, men of right feeling; exanimi sententia, according to our real opinion; and the very word animus is derived from anima. Again, the soul seems to Zeno the Stoic to be fire. X. But what I have said as to the heart, the blood, the brain, air, or fire being the soul, are common opinions; the others are only entertained by individuals; and indeed there were many among the ancients who held singular opinions on this subject, of whom the latest was Aristoxenos, a man who was both a musician and a philosopher. He maintained a certain straining of the body, like what is called harmony in music, to be the soul, and believed that from the figure and nature of the whole body various motions are excited, as sounds are from an instrument. He adhered steadily to his system, and yet he said something, the nature of which, whatever it was, had been detailed and explained a great while before by Plato. Xenocrates denied that the soul had any figure, or anything like a body, but said it was a number, the power of which, as Pythagoras had fancied, some ages before, was the greatest in nature. His master, Plato, imagined a threefold soul; a dominant portion of which, that is to say, reason, he had lodged in the head, as in a tower; and the other two parts, namely anger and desire, he made subservient to this one, and allotted them distinct abodes, placing anger in the breast, and desire under the praecordia. But Dicearchus, in that discourse of some learned disputants held at Corinth, which he details to us in 3 books, in the first book introduces many speakers, and in the other two he introduces a certain Pherocrates, an old man of Phthia, who, as he said, was descended from Deucalion, asserting that there is in fact no such thing at all as a soul, but that it is a name without a meaning, and that it is idle to use the expression animals, or animated beings; that neither men nor beasts have minds or souls, but that all that power by which we act or perceive is equally infused into every living creature, and is inseparable from the body. For if it were not, it would be nothing; nor is there anything whatever really existing except body, which is a single and simple thing, so fashioned as to live and have its sensations in consequence of the regulations of nature. Aristotle, a man superior to all others, both in genius and industry (I always except Plato), after having embraced these four known sorts of principles, from which all things deduce their origin, imagines that there is a certain fifth nature, from whence comes the soul. For to think, to foresee, to learn, to teach, to invent anything, and many other attributes of the same kind, such as to remember, to love, to hate, to desire, to fear, to be pleased or displeased, these and others like them exist, he thinks, in none of those first four kinds. On such account he adds a fifth kind, which has no name, and so by a new name he calls the soul endelechea, as if it were a certain continued and perpetual motion. XI. If I have not forgotten anything unintentionally, these are the principal opinions concerning the soul. I have omitted Democritus, a very great man indeed, but one who deduces the soul from the fortuitous concourse of small, light, and round substances; for if you believe men of his school, there is nothing which a crowd of atoms cannot effect. Which of these opinions is true, some God must determine. It is an important question for us, which has the most appearance of truth. Shall we, then, prefer determining between them, or shall we return to our subject? A. I could wish both, if possible, but it is difficult to mix them. Therefore, if without a discussion of them we can get rid of the fears of death, let us proceed to do so. But if this is not to be done without explaining the question about souls, let us have that now, and the other at another time. M. I take that plan to be the best which I perceive you are inclined to. For reason will demonstrate that, whichever of the opinions which I have stated is true, it must follow then that death cannot be an evil, or that it must rather be something desirable. For if either the heart, or the blood, or the brain is the soul, then certainly the soul, being corporeal, must perish with the rest of the body. If it is air, it will perhaps be dissolved; if it is fire, it will be extinguished; if it is Aristoxenos's harmony, it will be put out of tune. What shall I say of Dicaearchus, who denies that there is any soul? In all these opinions there is nothing to affect any one after death, for all feeling is lost with life, and where there is no sensation, nothing can interfere to affect us. The opinions of others do indeed bring us hope, if it is any pleasure to you to think that souls, after they leave the body, may go to heaven as to a permanent home. A. I have great pleasure in that thought, and it is what I most desire; and even if it should not be so, I should still be very willing to believe it. M. What occasion have you then for my assistance? Am I superior to Plato in eloquence? Turn over carefully his book that treats of the soul; you will have there all that you can want. A. I have indeed done that, and often; but I know not how it comes to pass. I agree with it while I am reading it; but when I have laid down the book, and begin to reflect with myself on the immortality of the soul, all that agreement vanishes. M. How comes that? Do you admit this, that souls either exist after death, or else that they also perish at the moment of death? A. I agree to that; and if they do exist, I admit that they are happy; but if they perish, I cannot suppose them to be unhappy, because, in fact, they have no existence at all. You drove me to that concession but just now. M. How then can you, or why do you, assert that you think that death is an evil, when it either makes us happy in the case of the soul continuing to exist, or at all events not unhappy in the case of our becoming destitute of all sensation? End of Book 1.